On the 3rd of September 1945, Ho Chi Minh stood before the people of Hanoi and presented his government's program for the newly declared Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The priorities were clear and deeply urgent. National independence came first. Anti-famine measures followed close behind. Democratic reforms would consolidate the authority of the Viet Minh, the broad coalition that had seized power during the August Revolution just weeks before. Yet even as these words were spoken, the reality on the ground was far more complicated than any declaration could capture. Vietnam in late 1945 was not a unified nation under a single authority. It was a patchwork of occupying forces, rival political movements, and competing visions for the future. The country had been divided by Allied agreement at the 16th parallel. North of that line, including Hanoi and the port city of Haiphong, Chinese nationalist troops under General Liu Han arrived in early September to accept the Japanese surrender. South of the line, including Saigon, British forces landed under Southeast Asia Command with the same mission. Two foreign armies now stood on Vietnamese soil, and neither had come to support Vietnamese independence. The Chinese occupation forces in the north tolerated Ho Chi Minh's government in Hanoi. They did not immediately seek to overthrow it, but they pressed Ho to broaden his coalition to include Chinese-backed Vietnamese nationalist parties that had long competed with the Viet Minh. The Vietnam QuocDan Dang, known by its initials VNQDD, and various Dai Viet nationalist factions had strong ties to Chinese authorities. They now demanded a share of power in the capital. In the south, the situation deteriorated far more quickly. British commanders in Saigon facilitated the return of French forces. By the 23rd of September 1945, French troops had retaken most of Saigon's main positions from groups aligned with the Viet Minh. Japanese soldiers who had been formally defeated were temporarily used by the British to help maintain order and fight Viet Minh units around the city. The complexity of those months defied simple explanation. The Viet Minh responded to the French reoccupation of Saigon with attacks on key installations: the power plant, the docks, Tan Son Nhut airfield. The city became a contested urban battlefield in late 1945, a preview of the wider conflict to come. Fighting spread through the surrounding countryside, and what some called the war in southern Vietnam began before diplomacy between France and the Democratic Republic had truly been attempted. In Hanoi, the new government moved to consolidate its position against rival nationalist organizations. On the 5th of September 1945, Interior Minister Von Nguyen Giap ordered the dissolution of the Dai Viet National Socialist Party, citing alleged collaboration with foreign forces. Clashes between Viet Minh supporters and VNQDD militants broke out in the Red River Delta. Near Vinh Yen, violent confrontations erupted shortly after the Viet Minh seized the capital, deepening tensions among Vietnamese factions. To secure Chinese goodwill and prevent direct intervention against his government, Ho Chi Minh made substantial contributions to the Chinese troops occupying the north. Rice and gold flowed to General Liu Han's forces during campaigns with names like Gold Week. The Viet Minh leadership understood they could not fight the Chinese and the French simultaneously. Better to appease one enemy while preparing for another. By late 1945 and into early 1946, as it became clear that Chinese forces would eventually withdraw, Viet Minh security forces carried out arrests against VNQDD members and other rival nationalists in northern urban centers. The political landscape had to be secured before new complications arose. And new complications were arising. The French, having regained their foothold in Saigon under British protection, were arguing in Paris for a robust military and political reassertion of control over all of Vietnam. the instability in the south provided their justification. On the 6th of March, 1946, Ho Chi Minh and French Commissioner Jean Santany signed a preliminary accord in Hanoi. The Ho-Santany Agreement recognized Vietnam as a free state within the French Union and allowed French troops to replace Chinese forces in the north. For Ho, it was a calculated gamble. The Chinese occupation had to end. The agreement provided for the gradual withdrawal of Chinese nationalist forces in exchange for up to 15,000 French soldiers in northern Vietnam. The VNQDD, whose position had depended heavily on Chinese protection, was weakened when Chinese forces withdrew in spring 1946. By June, the Chinese evacuation of Hanoi was complete. The Democratic Republic now faced French troops in the capital alongside Vietnamese authorities in a strange arrangement that some called cohabitation. In the months after March 1946, Hanoi and Haiphong experienced overlapping jurisdictions. French and Vietnamese administrations operated in parallel. Customs, policing, public order all became points of friction between two authorities that neither trusted nor respected the other. The Democratic Republic organized national elections in January 1946, using a united front list to broaden the regime's legitimacy. The Viet Minh authorities tightened control over the press while maintaining a facade of coalition government. In Cochinchina, far to the south, French authorities declared a separate autonomous state within a projected Indo-Chinese federation. The Democratic Republic viewed this as a direct violation of the March Accords, which had envisioned a unified Vietnam. The question of Cochinchina's status would poison negotiations for months to come. Ho Chi Minh traveled to France in mid-1946, leading a delegation to the Franco-Vietnamese Conference at Fontainebleau. From July to September, Vietnamese and French negotiators argued over fundamental questions. The Vietnamese delegation, led by Pham Van Dong, pressed for full independence and territorial unity, including Cochinchina. The French insisted on retaining Vietnam within the French Union and maintaining a separate status for the Southern Territory. Neither side would compromise on the issues that mattered most. The conference ended without settlement. On the 14th of September 1946, Ho signed a provisional modus vivendi with French Minister Moutet, seeking to maintain fragile peace and gain time. The document granted France significant economic and cultural privileges. Many Vietnamese nationalists criticized the agreement as too conciliatory. While the delegation had been abroad, High Commissioner Darjen Liu had organized a separate conference in Dalat with representatives from Cochinchina, South Annam, Cambodia, and Laos. A French-designed Indo-Chinese federation was being constructed without the Democratic Republic's participation. By late 1946, daily life in Hanoi reflected dual authority. French and Vietnamese flags flew in different quarters of the city. Separate police forces operated, sometimes in open competition. Small incidents over searches, checkpoints, and arrests accumulated into a pattern of deepening mutual distrust. Haiphong, the main northern port, became a focal point of tension. Both sides sought authority over incoming shipping. Control of customs meant control of revenue, and revenue meant power. On the 20th of November 1946, a dispute over the seizure of gasoline on a Chinese boat led to armed clashes between French naval personnel and Vietnamese forces. Casualties mounted on both sides. Following the clashes, French commanders issued ultimatums demanding Vietnamese withdrawal from parts of the port area. The Democratic Republic either rejected these demands or only partially implemented them. Then, on the 23rd of November 1946, French warships, including the cruiser Suffren, bombarded Vietnamese quarters of Haiphong. Estimates of Vietnamese dead ranged from 2,000 to 6,000. The bombardment forced Viet Minh units into urban fighting, followed by withdrawal. The path toward full-scale war had been opened. In the weeks between the Haiphong incident and mid-December, both sides continued negotiations, but local ceasefires remained fragile. On the 19th of December 1946, French General Morlier issued an ultimatum demanding that Viet Minh militias in Hanoi disarm completely. That evening, at about 8 o'clock, explosives detonated at Hanoi's power plant. The city plunged into darkness, and coordinated Viet Minh attacks on French targets began. In the days that followed, Democratic Republic leaders evacuated Hanoi for the Viet Bac resistance base area in the mountains. The government transformed from an urban administration into a largely rural wartime organization. By early January 1947, French troops had regained most of Hanoi. The Viet Minh Capital Regiment continued to resist in parts of the Old Quarter until mid-February before withdrawing across the Red River. The 19th of December 1946 is widely regarded as the formal beginning of the First Indochina War. Unresolved disputes over Cochin China, the failure of Fontainebleau, competition over customs and security, and mutual distrust had brought the fragile post-August Revolution period to its end. A bilateral war between the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and France had begun. After the initial fighting in Hanoi on the 19th of December 1946, French forces consolidated control over the central districts of the city. The streets that had echoed with gunfire and explosions gradually fell under the authority of French garrisons. Viet Minh units fell back toward the city's outskirts and the nearby rural zones, where the terrain offered cover and the population was more sympathetic to the resistance. The pattern of withdrawal had begun. In late December 1946, the leadership of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam made a difficult decision. Hanoi could not be held against superior French firepower. The government that had declared independence in September 1945 would have to abandon the capital. A phased evacuation of key government organs toward the Viet Bac base area began in the final days of the year. Ho Chi Minh himself left Hanoi in those closing days of December, traveling northward toward the mountainous region that would shelter the resistance for years to come. The Viet Bac, located in the provinces north of Hanoi such as Tuan Quang and Bac Can, was selected as the main resistance base for reasons that made strategic sense. The terrain was difficult. Mountains and dense forests offered natural protection against conventional military operations, and the Viet Minh had been present there since the earliest days of their movement, building networks of support among local populations. By early January 1947, French forces had reoccupied most provincial capitals in northern and central Vietnam. Their strategy emphasized control of towns and communication routes rather than immediate, deep penetration into rural areas. The cities and roads would be held first. The countryside could wait. The Viet Minh's Capital Regiment continued organized resistance inside Hanoi's Old Quarter into February 1947, fighting street by street. When they finally withdrew across the Red River in mid-February, it marked the completion of the shift from urban defense to rural guerrilla positions. The war had entered a new phase. In Viet Bac, the Democratic Republic reconstituted its central offices during early 1947. Operations were dispersed across multiple locations to reduce vulnerability to French attacks. No single headquarters could be targeted. The resistance would be decentralized by necessity and by design. As the leadership relocated, calls went out for what was termed a long-term resistance, built on self-reliance. The message was clear. This would not be a war of quick victories or decisive battles. This would be a protracted struggle, fought over years rather than months, requiring patience and sacrifice from everyone who believed in independence. The French High Command in Indochina adopted a strategy during early 1947 that centered on holding major cities, ports, and key roads and rivers. The goal was to isolate Viet Minh forces from urban and coastal populations, cutting them off from economic resources and human capital concentrated in the lowlands. French units built a chain of blockhouses and posts along key routes such as Route 5 between Hanoi and Haiphong and Route 1 running from Hanoi through Nam Dinh toward Vinh. Pacification, as the French termed their strategy, meant stationing small garrisons in fortified posts along major roads and waterways. These posts were manned by mixed units of metropolitan French soldiers, colonial troops from North and West Africa, and locally recruited auxiliaries. The empire's diversity was on full display in every garrison. But the pattern of warfare that emerged was not one of French dominance. The Viet Minh established village-level committees and guerrilla cells that could operate semi-autonomously, supporting the broader resistance effort while maintaining intimate knowledge of local terrain. This decentralized network would prove remarkably resilient against conventional military pressure. The Viet Minh's early military doctrine after December 1946 emphasized combining small unit guerrilla actions with political mobilization. This approach, sometimes described as People's War and All-People Resistance, meant that every village could become a battlefield and every peasant a potential combatant or supporter. From early 1947 onwards, French garrisons in towns such as Nam Dinh, Hai Duong, and Bac Ninh faced frequent nighttime attacks and sabotage operations. Telegraph lines were cut, small bridges were destroyed, convoys were forced into predictable routes where ambushes could be organized with careful preparation. French authorities responded by restructuring their forces into mobile columns capable of striking out from urban centers to conduct mopping-up operations against suspected Viet Minh bases. But the guerrillas knew the terrain better, moved faster through familiar paths, and could disperse into the population when pursued. During the first half of 1947, communications from the Democratic Republic's headquarters in Viet Bac instructed regional commanders to avoid frontal clashes with large French units. Ambushes, raids, and disruption of supply lines were the priority. Fight where you are strong. Avoid battle where the enemy is strong. Wait for better opportunities. In the central region, French forces maintained control over cities such as Hue and Da Nang, but encountered growing Viet Minh activity in the surrounding highlands and rural districts. The Democratic Republic's leadership in Viet Bac relied on a network of couriers and liaison officers to maintain contact with resistance zones far to the south, compensating for limited radio capabilities. By mid-1947, Viet Minh military organization in northern Vietnam had evolved beyond local guerrillas to include regional units and main force battalions capable of coordinated operations. Early French intelligence assessments underestimated this capacity for growth and adaptation. In Hanoi, French authorities created fortified neighborhoods and curfews intended to limit Viet Minh infiltration into European and administrative quarters. But Viet Minh networks in the outskirts and in the Red River Delta worked to maintain clandestine supply routes into the capital, moving food, information, and weapons through invisible channels. The Democratic Republic used Viet Bac not only as military headquarters, but also as a political and propaganda center, producing broadcasts and documents to support resistance nationwide. The mountains had become the new capital of a government determined to survive. The experience of 1947 taught important lessons. For the French, it confirmed that controlling major towns did not automatically translate into control over the surrounding countryside. The post system dispersed forces across many small positions, reducing the number of troops available for large offensive operations. For the Viet Minh, the early campaigns reinforced the emphasis on decentralized operations. Local forces played a central role in wearing down French mobility. The Democratic Republic continued to refine administrative structures in Viet Minh, including interzone commands that coordinated both civil governance and military operations across the mountainous north. French military planning in 1947 increasingly focused on the perceived need to decapitate the Viet Minh by striking at the Viet Bac leadership hub. On the 9th of June 1947, the Indochina Defense Council approved a plan for a large campaign against the Viet Bac base area that autumn. French commanders believed that capturing or killing Ho Chi Minh and the main leaders could bring a rapid end to the conflict. The Viet Minh, anticipating such a move, prepared contingency arrangements to disperse leadership and archives in case of major offensive. In the first half of 1947, defensive positions were improved along key routes such as Route 3 and Route 4, expecting a French push from the lowlands. Operation Leah, launched in October 1947, was the principal French offensive of the year. It combined airborne landings near Bac Can with ground advances along Route 4 and other axes, reflecting French confidence in mobility and firepower. French paratroopers briefly occupied Bac Can and seized government documents, but they failed to capture Ho Chi Minh or the top leadership who had evacuated in time. Viet Minh forces responded by avoiding large set-piece battles and instead harassing French columns along forest roads and river crossings. In the Road 4 sector during autumn and winter, Viet Minh units used ambushes around Dong Cay and That Cay to inflict losses on convoys. French forces held isolated posts deep in Viet Bac but lacked sufficient troops to secure territory between positions. The gaps proved fatal to the campaign's ambitions. By late 1947, the French concept of striking fast to win fast had not been achieved. The failure to capture the leadership preserved the political center of the resistance. After Operation Leah, French troops withdrew many forward positions, returning to a posture focused on controlling the lowlands. In Tonkin, French domination of major cities contrasted with Viet Minh influence across much of the countryside. Neither side could claim complete control. By the end of 1947, both sides recognized that the conflict had shifted from an expected short campaign to a drawn-out war. The Democratic Republic's successful relocation to and survival in the Viet Bac resistance heartland laid the foundation for everything that would follow. From 1947 onwards, the main French field formation in Indochina was the French Far East Expeditionary Corps, known by its French initials as CEFEO. This force bore responsibility for conducting operations across Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. It was a truly multinational enterprise drawing on the full resources of a colonial empire, and its commanders would directly shape the course of the war. Overall, French military command in Indochina passed through several hands between 1947 and 1951, each commander bringing his own approach to the conflict. General Jean-Étienne Vallouis held command until 1948, emphasizing the effort to regain control of key communication lines in Tonkin and suppress Viet Minh base areas through mobile operations. General Roger Blazeau followed from 1948 to 1949, consolidating the system of territorial commands with separate sectors for Tonkin, Annam, and Cochinchina. General Marcel Carpentier presided over the period from 1949 to 1950, when the Chinese Communist victory enabled major Viet Minh reinforcement from across the northern border. And in late 1950, after serious French reverses on Route Coloniale 4, General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny took command and reorganized French defenses in northern Vietnam. The French High Command divided Indochina into regional commands corresponding roughly to the major geographic zones. Each region had its own sector and subsector system for local operations. This structure reflected both the vastness of the territory and the limitations of available forces. French strategy from 1947 to 1951 combined defense of the main deltas and cities with attempts at pacification of surrounding rural areas through a network of strongpoints. Pacification often meant stationing small garrisons in fortified posts along major roads and waterways. The posts aimed to project authority into the countryside and protect convoys moving supplies and troops. In Tonkin, French units built a chain of blockhouses and posts along key routes such as Route 5 connecting Hanoi to Haiphong and Route 1 running south from Hanoi through Nam Dinh toward Vinh. The posts were manned by mixed units of metropolitan French soldiers, colonial troops, and locally recruited auxiliaries. Many of these positions were little more than bunkers surrounded by barbed wire and firing positions, intended to resist Viet Minh assaults long enough for relief columns to arrive. The French term quadrillage referred to a grid system of territorial control, with units assigned to patrol and secure geographically defined sectors. Road defense practice included clearing operations along a route followed by leaving small posts to hold the ground and deter Viet Minh re-entry. After 1949, French posts increasingly relied on locally raised suppletive auxiliaries and State of Vietnam troops to provide manpower for static defense. In 1951, de Lattre developed what became known as the de Lattre Line, a dense belt of fortified positions and blockhouses around the perimeter of the Red River Delta. This line aimed to prevent large Viet Minh formations from penetrating into the delta and threatening Hanoi or Haiphong. The fortifications represented the most concentrated defensive effort of the war. French Union ground forces in Indochina were remarkably diverse, drawing personnel from across the empire. Between 1947 and 1954, approximately 122,900 North African soldiers, mainly Algerian, Moroccan, and Tunisian, served in Indochina. Around 60,340 sub-Saharan African soldiers also deployed to the theater. About half of all French Union troops were recruited locally, including Vietnamese, Cambodians, and Laotians, loyal to French-backed authorities. Vietnamese units serving with the French were progressively integrated into the State of Vietnam's National Army after its creation in 1949. The French Foreign Legion provided a disproportionately large share of professional infantry units for both offensive and garrison duties. Legion battalions were frequently assigned to the most difficult sectors, including frontier posts and mobile reaction forces in Tonkin and Annam. Shortages of metropolitan French conscripts led Paris to rely heavily on colonial soldiers and volunteers, reflecting manpower constraints at home. French naval and riverine forces operated patrol boats and landing craft on major rivers and canals to support road defense and amphibious operations. This was particularly important in Cochinchina, where the Mekong Delta's waterways were essential for movement and supply. French Dinosaur River flotillas in the Mekong and Red River deltas combined gunboats and infantry detachments to escort convoys and raid Viet Minh-controlled riverbanks. French air units provided reconnaissance, transport, and close support, but limited aircraft numbers and weather conditions constrained their effectiveness, especially in the northern highlands where cloud and jungle canopy hindered observation and targeting. Strategically, early French objectives included securing Saigon and Cochinchina's rice-producing areas, holding the central coastal cities, and retaining Hanoi and Haiphong as political and logistical hubs. In Cochinchina, commanders used pacification agreements with religious sects and local elites to stabilize rice-growing regions. In Tonkin, clear and hold operations aimed to secure populations and rice supplies. French civil and military authorities tried to separate Viet Minh guerrillas from rural populations by creating protected villages and fortified hamlets under government supervision. The emergence of the Bao Dai-led state of Vietnam in 1949 was central to French political strategy, offering an alternative Vietnamese authority to counter the Democratic Republic's claim to legitimacy. French strategy also sought to frame the war as part of the broader Cold War, emphasizing the fight against communism to gain American financial and material support. By 1950, United States military and economic aid began to flow directly to the French war effort, easing some resource constraints but not resolving the fundamental manpower shortages that plagued operations. Terrain posed major limitations for French forces throughout the war. Jungle-covered mountains, narrow valleys, and poor roads made it difficult to sustain operations far from established river and road networks. Seasonal monsoon rains regularly disrupted supply lines, hampered vehicle movement, and complicated air operations for months at a time. Viet Minh control of large rural areas allowed them to interdict roads and railways, forcing French convoys into repetitive, vulnerable routes where ambushes could be prepared. Political constraints in metropolitan France limited the government's willingness to expand conscription or commit substantially larger forces to the Indochina theater. Frequent changes in French commanders and governments in Paris contributed to strategic inconsistency and periodic shifts between offensive and defensive postures. French counterinsurgency doctrine in Indochina remained a mix of conventional warfare concepts and ad hoc adaptations, with no single unified manual for pacification during this period. In practice, operations often alternated between large sweeps by mobile groups and static defense in posts, leaving gaps that Viet Minh forces exploited with patience and local knowledge. In the late 1940s, French mobile groups, called groupements mobiles, were formed as combined arms, regimental-sized units designed for rapid reaction and offensive operations. These groups typically combined infantry, armor, artillery, and engineers, giving commanders flexible tools to reinforce threatened sectors or exploit opportunities when they arose. Despite these considerable efforts, the French road and strongpoint system tended to disperse forces across many small posts, reducing the number of troops available for large offensive operations. The strategic tension between holding territory and concentrating force for decisive action remained unresolved throughout these years. The RC-4 disaster in 1950, involving the loss of Cao Bang and Dong Cu, highlighted the vulnerability of isolated posts along exposed frontier roads. After those setbacks, French command became more cautious about maintaining long, thinly held road lines in mountainous border areas. De Lattre's arrival in late 1950 led to a more aggressive use of mobile reserves, artillery, and air power to defeat large Viet Minh attacks on the Tonkin Delta perimeter in 1951. Battles at VinhIen, Mao Kê, and the Day River showed French intention to draw Viet Minh main forces into attacking fortified lines where firepower advantages could be maximized. By 1951, French doctrine in Tonkin increasingly aimed to induce Viet Minh attacks against prepared strongpoints rather than seeking deep offensive thrusts into Viet Minh base areas. The need to simultaneously defend Laos, Cambodia, and multiple Vietnamese regions stretched French Union forces, requiring compromises between concentration and territorial coverage. Efforts to build up the Vietnamese National Army were intended both to share the burden of static defense and to demonstrate progress toward Vietnamese associated state status. Despite incremental reorganization and growing American backing, by the end of 1951, France still faced a determined and capable opponent with secure base areas and significant popular support in many rural zones. After relocating to Viet Bac in early 1947, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam maintained a central leadership core that would guide the resistance for years to come. Ho Chi Minh served as president, the public face of the movement and symbol of national independence. Truong Chin held the position of Party General Secretary, directing the ideological and organizational work that held the movement together. And Vo Nguyen Giap served as Defense Minister and Army Commander, the man who would transform peasant guerrillas into a fighting force capable of defeating a colonial army. The Viet Minh and the government they led operated through overlapping party and state organs. The Indochinese Communist Party, soon to be reorganized as the Vietnam Workers' Party in practice, provided strategic direction to the government in resistance. Every major decision flowed through party channels before becoming state policy. The Party Central Committee and its Standing Commission in Viet Bac issued key directives on both military strategy and political mobilization between 1947 and 1951. The base area itself was divided into resistance zones and interzones, each with a hierarchy of party committees, military commands, and administrative bodies to coordinate local governance and military activity. At the provincial level, resistance war committees and people's committees oversaw administration, taxation, and mobilization, linking the center to village authorities across the mountainous north. The Viet Minh armed forces were structured on 3 levels, each serving a distinct role in the broader strategy of People's War. At the top were the main force regular units organized into regiments and, by 1949 to 1951, divisions such as the 308th and 312th. These formations represented the conventional striking power of the movement, capable of massing for major operations when conditions permitted. Below the regular forces were regional units operating at interzone or provincial level. These provided more mobile support than village guerrillas, but remained closely connected to local terrain and populations. They could reinforce regular forces when needed or conduct independent operations in their home territories. At the base of the pyramid were local guerrilla units, typically part-time fighters drawn from villages. These men and women were responsible for surveillance, sabotage, and supporting regular forces with guides and porters. They knew every path, every hiding place, every family that could be trusted. Viet Minh doctrine stressed that regular forces should help train regional and local guerrillas, reinforcing a unified military system across all 3 levels. Truong Chin and other leaders described revolutionary warfare as passing through stages. Guerrilla warfare would predominate initially, wearing down the enemy through countless small actions. More conventional operations would develop later, when the balance of forces had shifted. This phased approach required patience and discipline from everyone involved. During 1947 and 1948, guerrilla warfare remained the dominant form of combat in most of northern and central Vietnam, especially around the Red River Delta and the approaches to Viet Bac. Viet Minh guerrilla tactics included ambushes on roads, harassment of outposts, night attacks, and sabotage of bridges, railways, and telegraph lines. The Viet Minh deliberately avoided prolonged engagement with large French columns unless terrain and preparation offered clear advantages. Base areas such as Viet Bac served as secure zones for training, logistics, political education, and shelter for leadership. These were distinct from contested front areas nearer French strongpoints. In Viet Bac, the Democratic Republic established schools, training centers, and rudimentary factories in dispersed locations to reduce vulnerability to air and ground attack. The government promoted what it called all-people resistance, calling on civilians to contribute labor, food, and information while maintaining production in liberated and semi-liberated areas. Viet Minh supply doctrine emphasized self-reliance, with base areas expected to support the war effort through local agriculture, handicraft production, and tax collection. The movement could not depend on external support that might never arrive. Transport systems relied heavily on human porters, bicycle convoys, and hidden depots, allowing supplies to move from Viet Bac toward front areas despite French control of main roads. The Viet Minh organized transport brigades and logistics units responsible for moving ammunition, food, and equipment along trails that bypassed French positions. Every supply run was a triumph of organization and endurance. Political commissars were attached to Viet Minh units at various levels to conduct political education, maintain discipline, and explain policies to soldiers. Political education emphasized national independence, social justice, and loyalty to the Democratic Republic, framing the war as both a national liberation and social transformation struggle. Propaganda was disseminated through newspapers, wall posters, traveling cultural troops, and loudspeaker broadcasts in villages and base areas. From 1948, the Democratic Republic and Viet Minh organized patriotic emulation campaigns, encouraging civilians and soldiers to increase productivity, recruitment, and combat effectiveness. These emulation movements rewarded exemplary units, cadres, and villagers with public recognition, aiming to link personal prestige to contribution to the resistance. Honor became a currency of its own. Population mobilization work included building mass organizations for workers, peasants, youth, women, and intellectuals, each tasked with supporting the war in specific ways. In the countryside, the Viet Minh promoted rent reduction and tax relief for poorer peasants as a way to consolidate support without immediately implementing full land redistribution. Decrees offered reductions of land rent and interest rates, and occasionally debt remission, to weaken landlord influence and strengthen peasant backing. Leadership figures around Ho Chi Minh, including Truong Chun Chi, argued for a gradual agrarian policy before full land reform to avoid destabilizing alliances during the war. In many Viet Minh-influenced villages, communal rice paddies and public lands were redistributed or managed collectively to support soldiers' families and local administration. Village authorities typically combined elected elements with party guidance, with key posts often held by trusted local cadres. By 1948 and 1949, Viet Minh regular forces expanded from roughly 50,000 to about 250,000 soldiers and militia, reflecting successful mobilization and recruitment campaigns. Organizational reforms in 1949 and 1950 created full divisions, allowing the Viet Minh to conduct larger operations while still relying on local forces for support and diversion. The Viet Minh maintained a distinct separation between political and military chains of command on paper, but in practice party committees strongly influenced operational decisions. Zone and interzone commands integrated civilian and military planning, coordinating tax raises, conscription, and supply for campaigns. After the successful defense of Viet Minh in autumn and winter 1947, documents described this as a victory that enabled expansion of organization and cadre training. Central directives stressed the need to pacify the free zones, meaning consolidating party and state control in areas already largely outside French authority. Cadre training courses in base areas covered both administrative skills and basic military knowledge, preparing personnel for dual civil-military roles at local level. Relations with ethnic minority groups in Viet Minh and Highland areas were managed through promises of autonomy and targeted propaganda in local languages. Cadres in minority regions were instructed to respect local customs while promoting participation in the common resistance. The Democratic Republic's diplomatic messaging during this period sought international recognition, but internally it emphasized self-reliance and domestic mobilization. After the Chinese Communist victory in 1949, the Viet Minh benefited from increased external support, but still relied heavily on internal logistics and base area production. Chinese assistance from 1950 included training, weapons, and doctrinal guidance. Viet Minh writings increasingly referenced Maoist concepts of protracted people's war, adjusting them to Vietnamese terrain and social structures. Even as divisions formed and large battles began in 1951, the Viet Minh leadership insisted that guerrilla warfare and political work remained essential. In early 1951, Vu Nguyen Giap's general counteroffensive around the Red River Delta relied on divisions supported by regional and local forces providing diversionary attacks and logistical backing. Viet Minh planners accepted that assaults on fortified French lines would incur heavy losses, but considered such operations a necessary step toward higher stage warfare. Despite the shift toward larger operations, command orders still called for maintaining guerrilla warfare behind French lines. The combination of centralized leadership in Viet Minh, layered military forces, and extensive local political networks formed the core of Viet Minh's strategy between 1947 and 1951. By the end of 1951, the Viet Minh had developed a functioning state in arms in northern Vietnam. Base areas like Viet Minh supported both government institutions and growing conventional military formations. The foundation for the campaigns to come had been laid. The outbreak of fighting in Hanoi in December 1946 triggered the first wave of civilians moving from contested urban neighborhoods into nearby rural areas or safer city districts. Families gathered what they could carry and fled toward wherever seemed less dangerous than where they were. The pattern of displacement had begun, and it would continue for years. In early 1947, residents of towns along key roads in Tonkin, such as Route 4 and Route 3, began leaving villages close to French posts or frequent ambush sites. Living near a road that both sides wanted to control meant living in perpetual danger. As French forces reoccupied provincial capitals, some urban dwellers relocated into Viet Minh-controlled countryside to avoid conscription, taxation, or surveillance by French authorities. Others suspected of Viet Minh sympathies moved in the opposite direction, toward French-held towns, seeking protection from guerrilla harassment or pressure for contributions to the resistance. Coastal and delta areas under more stable French control, particularly in Cochinchina, attracted rural migrants seeking access to markets and relative security. In Viet Minh base zones such as Viet Minh, upland villages saw an influx of displaced people from lowland districts affected by fighting and French road operations. The war disrupted pre-war patterns of seasonal labor migration, with many peasants unable to travel safely between provinces for plantation or construction work. Trade routes by road and rail were frequently interrupted by ambushes, sabotage, and security checkpoints, making commerce unpredictable and dangerous. The Hanoi-Haiphong rail and road corridor, though heavily guarded by French forces, experienced recurring disruptions that affected the movement of rice, coal, and manufactured goods throughout the region. River and canal transport in the Mekong and Red River deltas remained vital for moving goods, but boats faced inspection by both French and Viet Minh authorities, along with occasional interdiction when crossing between zones of control. Rural markets in contested areas sometimes operated only during limited hours or on irregular days to reduce exposure to raids or clashes between armed forces. Agricultural production in many lowland areas continued despite the war, but was affected by forced labor demands, requisitions by whichever side controlled the area, and the need to farm around minefields and security zones established near major roads and French posts. In Viet Minh-influenced regions, authorities promoted campaigns to increase rice production and diversify crops to support both civilian and military consumption. The Democratic Republic called for 3 fights campaigns against hunger, illiteracy, and foreign domination, encouraging communities to prioritize food production despite wartime conditions. In French-controlled areas, commanders sought to encourage rice cultivation and allow peasants to sell surplus on markets to stabilize rural life. Both sides imposed taxes in their areas of control, often in rice, livestock, or cash. Villagers in zones where control shifted or overlapped faced a double burden, required to pay whoever happened to be in charge at any given moment. Viet Minh tax regulations typically set rates according to landholding and harvest size, with poorer peasants expected to contribute less. In French-held zones, official taxes were supplemented by fees and levies for local security forces. The Democratic Republic organized rice and clothing collection drives for frontline units, including widely publicized winter clothing and gold for the nation campaigns. French and State of Vietnam administrations operated rationing systems for certain imported goods and fuel in major cities when supply routes were strained. Inflation and currency instability affected both French and Viet Minh zones, with multiple currencies and scripts circulating simultaneously in some regions. Daily life in Hanoi, Saigon, and Hue adjusted to curfews, identity checks, and occasional searches by security forces. Urban residents often kept emergency stocks of rice and basic goods due to the risk of sudden supply interruptions or road closures. In many towns, nighttime lighting was reduced and movement restricted to minimize vulnerability to attacks. In Viet Minh base areas, households adapted by digging shelters, dispersing stored grain, and camouflaging workshops to reduce exposure to air or ground raids. Schooling continued intermittently in both French and Viet Minh-controlled areas, but classes were frequently suspended or relocated due to military activity. The Democratic Republic promoted literacy campaigns in Viet Bac and other liberated zones, linking reading instruction to political texts and basic wartime information. French-run schools in cities maintained curricula influenced by pre-war colonial models, but had to accommodate wartime shortages of teachers and materials. Health services were strained everywhere across Vietnam during these years. Shortages of medicines and trained personnel were particularly acute in rural Viet Minh zones, where the movement established makeshift clinics and mobile medical teams, relying heavily on traditional herbal remedies and basic hygiene campaigns to prevent disease outbreaks. In French-controlled cities, hospitals functioned more regularly but faced overcrowding and limited resources during periods of intense fighting or when refugee inflows overwhelmed their capacity. Women's organizations on the Viet Minh side, such as Women for National Salvation and related unions, mobilized women for production, logistics, and essential support roles in the resistance. These groups coordinated sewing of uniforms and supplies, food preparation for fighters, agricultural work to maintain production, and care for wounded soldiers and displaced persons in resistance zones. Youth organizations in Democratic Republic areas trained young people in basic first aid, message carrying, and local defense tasks, preparing the next generation alongside their educational activities. In French-held towns, women were active in market trade and small businesses, adapting to chronic shortages and fluctuating prices by diversifying their income sources and finding creative solutions to daily challenges. Many families split members between different zones of control during this period, with some relatives residing in French areas for employment opportunities or physical safety, and others remaining in Viet Minh zones for political commitments or personal reasons. The separation of families across front lines became one of the quieter tragedies of the conflict. Religious communities, including Buddhist pagodas and Catholic parishes, provided charitable relief, schooling, and limited shelter to displaced persons where circumstances allowed, often serving as neutral ground in a landscape divided by war. In Cochinchina, conflicts involving religious sects such as the Cao Dai and Hoa Hao and various local forces led some rural populations to relocate closer to sect-controlled villages or French posts for protection. The war affected plantation economies significantly, with some rubber estates in Cochinchina continuing production under French security arrangements, while others saw labor flight or deliberate sabotage by resistance forces. Coal mining in northern Vietnam, especially around Han Gai and Cam Phay along the coast, was disrupted by Viet Minh attacks on facilities and labor shortages as workers fled or were conscripted, reducing vital coal exports. Black markets flourished in both French and Viet Minh zones, moving rice, salt, textiles, and imported goods across front lines, despite official controls. Both sides used propaganda to shape civilian perceptions of the conflict, distributing leaflets, posters, and radio broadcasts in Vietnamese and minority languages. Families in contested areas often developed detailed contingency plans for rapid evacuation when violence approached, including pre-packed bundles of essential items and agreed meeting points where scattered family members could reunite. Many rural households adapted their cropping patterns to wartime conditions, introducing secondary crops like cassava and maize as insurance against rice shortfalls caused by requisitions or crop destruction. In some Viet Minh zones, communal labor days were organized for building roads, repairing irrigation, or supporting military logistics. French-aligned administrations in safer delta areas encouraged reconstruction of dikes and canals to maintain rice yields despite labor disruptions. The blurred boundary between civilian and combatant roles, especially in guerrilla zones, complicated efforts by both sides to distinguish non-combatants from fighters. Households in many areas encountered overlapping legal systems, with Democratic Republic regulations applied in Viet Minh zones and French or State of Vietnam laws in government-held territory. The cumulative economic impact of the war by 1950 included reduced export volumes, damaged infrastructure, and regional differences in recovery depending on local security conditions. By the end of that year, large parts of rural northern and central Vietnam had adapted to a semi-permanent wartime economy in which production, mobility, and social life were organized around the needs and constraints of ongoing conflict. This was the new normal, and it would persist for years to come. In 1949, as Chinese Communist forces advanced toward victory in the Chinese Civil War, Viet Minh leaders watched developments across the northern border with growing anticipation. The potential opening of a friendly rear transformed their long-term calculations. What had been a difficult but manageable war of resistance might soon become something quite different. The establishment of the People's Republic of China on the 1st of October 1949 created a neighboring state ideologically aligned with the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The strategic environment on the Sino-Vietnamese frontier changed overnight. Before formal recognition, Chinese Communist Party organs in Guangxi and Yunnan began limited contacts with Viet Minh representatives in late 1949 to explore future cooperation. Channels were opening that had never existed before. On the 15th of January 1950, the Democratic Republic of Vietnam's government publicly recognized the People's Republic of China, signaling Hanoi's intention to align diplomatically with Beijing. 3 days later, on the 18th of January 1950, the Chinese government formally recognized the Democratic Republic of Vietnam and established diplomatic relations. The People's Republic was the first state to recognize the Democratic Republic, providing Hanoi with crucial international legitimacy during the First Indochina War. On the 20th of January 1950, the Soviet Union announced diplomatic recognition of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, becoming the second major communist power to do so. Soviet recognition followed consultations among Ho Chi Minh, Mao Zedong, and Joseph Stalin, during which Stalin endorsed a division of labor. China would take the lead in aiding the Democratic Republic militarily, while Moscow would provide political backing and channel support through Beijing. After Chinese and Soviet recognition of the Democratic Republic, the United States and United Kingdom quickly recognized the French-backed state of Vietnam under Bao Dai in February 1950. This sequence of mutual recognitions in early 1950 contributed to the framing of the Indochina conflict as part of a wider Cold War confrontation. What had been a colonial war was becoming something larger. In early 1950, Viet Minh leaders decided to prioritize securing the northern border region to open stable land routes to the People's Republic. The Democratic Republic and China agreed to establish crossing points and liaison mechanisms along the Guangxi-Tonkin border to facilitate movement of personnel and supplies. By spring 1950, Viet Minh regimental-level units were being sent into southern China, notably to Mong Tu in Yunnan and Hoa Dong in Guangxi, for re-equipment and training. Chinese authorities created training bases where Viet Minh officers and soldiers received instruction in infantry tactics, logistics, and political work. The quality of their preparation improved dramatically. The People's Republic formed the Chinese Military Advisory Group in 1950, led by Wei Guoqing, with senior participation from General Chen Geng. These advisors worked with Viet Minh headquarters to reorganize units, improve staff work, and plan forthcoming operations along the border. Chinese advisors helped the Viet Minh adopt more systematic command structures, including divisional and regimental staffs modeled partly on People's Liberation Army practice. From 1950 onward, Chinese assistance included small arms, machine guns, mortars, artillery pieces, communications equipment, and medical supplies. The flow of material transformed what had been a guerrilla force operating on minimal resources into something approaching a conventional army. Chinese support also encompassed technical training for Vietnamese officers in communications, mechanics, and engineering at schools established in Guangxi and Yunnan, specifically for this purpose. Chinese and Viet Minh planners discussed campaign doctrine emphasizing coordinated attacks on French posts, encirclement of road segments, and concentrated use of artillery where available. The Vietnamese officers who returned from training in China brought with them new skills and a new confidence in what their forces could accomplish. The Viet Minh border campaign of autumn 1950, known as Chien Dich Bien Joy, was the first major operation for which Viet Minh units had been systematically trained and equipped in China beforehand. The scale of preparations exceeded anything the movement had previously attempted. Stockpiling ammunition and food in depots near the frontier was supported by supply lines crossing from Chinese territory. During the campaign itself, the People's Republic effectively served as a rear area, allowing Viet Minh units to receive supplies and, in some cases, withdraw temporarily beyond French reach when tactical situations demanded it. Chinese military advisors did not directly command Viet Minh units in combat, but provided planning guidance, training, and evaluation of operations. The success of the border campaign, including the fall of French positions such as Dong Quai and Cao Bang, gave the Democratic Republic control over much of the frontier with China. Control of the northern border allowed the Democratic Republic to establish more regularized logistics corridors for weapons, ammunition, and material from the People's Republic and, indirectly, the Soviet Union. After 1950, Soviet military aid to the Democratic Republic was generally funneled through China, reflecting Stalin's view that Beijing should manage day-to-day support. Soviet assistance in this period was more limited than Chinese aid and focused primarily on political backing, some material support, and coordination with Beijing. The Democratic Republic used its new diplomatic recognition to open embassies in Beijing and Moscow, strengthening political ties and channels for aid. Chinese advisors provided not only military guidance, but also advice on land reform, mass mobilization, and cadre training, sharing Chinese revolutionary experience with their Vietnamese counterparts. Viet Minh leadership incorporated elements of Maoist doctrine on protracted People's War and base area construction, adapting them to Vietnamese conditions. Chinese training materials influenced Viet Minh approaches to political work within the army, including the role of political commissars and party cells in units. The new access to supplies allowed Viet Minh forces to increase the scale of operations, moving from predominantly guerrilla actions to larger offensives involving regiments and emerging divisions. Border control also enabled the Democratic Republic to improve its rear area medical facilities, with some wounded evacuated into China for treatment. Chinese recognition and aid strengthened the position of pro-Beijing currents within Viet Minh and Democratic Republic leadership circles, though Ho Chi Minh sought to balance relations with both China and the Soviet Union, maintaining Vietnamese autonomy within the broader communist world. For French planners, the creation of a communist-aligned China sharing a long border with Vietnam raised serious concerns about potential large-scale Chinese intervention in Indochina, similar to what had occurred in Korea. After Chinese and Soviet recognition of the Democratic Republic, French officials increasingly described the Indochina conflict in terms of containing communist expansion in Southeast Asia. The war was no longer simply about restoring colonial authority. It had become part of a global struggle. In January 1950, France recognized the state of Vietnam as an associated state within the French Union, partly to offer a non-communist Vietnamese government as an alternative to Ho Chi Minh's regime. The United States, influenced by the establishment of the People's Republic and its support for the Democratic Republic, began in 1950 to provide military and economic assistance to the French and the state of Vietnam. American aid included arms, equipment, and advisory support, with the stated aim of strengthening French-led forces against a now China-backed Viet Minh. American policy documents from 1950 framed Indochina as a key front in the global struggle against communism, linking Chinese support for the Democratic Republic to wider regional security concerns. French intelligence noted the improved armament and training of Viet Minh troops, attributing these changes to Chinese communist assistance. The loss of the northern border posts in 1950 was seen in Paris and Saigon as a major strategic setback, since it opened an uninterrupted land bridge between the Democratic Republic and China. In response, the French government appointed General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny as High Commissioner and Commander-in-Chief in December 1950. His subsequent construction of a fortified line around the Red River Delta was partly intended to counter the enhanced capabilities of a China-supported Viet Minh. The shift in the military balance led Viet Minh planners to contemplate more ambitious operations. Chinese logistical support allowed accumulation of reserves sufficient to sustain multi-week campaigns, impossible earlier in the war. The Democratic Republic's diplomatic status as a recognized government by major communist powers improved its standing internationally. By the end of 1950, Chinese communist victory and subsequent recognition and support for the Democratic Republic had transformed the First Indochina War from a largely colonial conflict into a theater of Cold War competition. External great power backing now flowed to both sides, raising the stakes for everyone involved. In 1948, American policymakers generally viewed the Indochina conflict as a secondary colonial issue. Containment efforts focused on Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, where the Cold War stakes seemed most immediate. Indochina was far away, and France's determination to restore its colonial position made the situation complicated for a nation that had once championed self-determination. The United States had no desire to become entangled in another nation's colonial war. Yet circumstances were changing rapidly, and the calculations that seemed clear in 1948 would look very different by 1950. Early State Department analyses in 1948 and 1949 warned that a complete French defeat in Indochina could have adverse effects on regional stability and Western prestige in Asia. The Truman Doctrine and broader containment strategy provided the conceptual framework within which Indochina was later interpreted as a potential front against communist expansion. A July 1949 policy paper on Indochina concluded that American interests lay in preventing a communist takeover while avoiding direct colonial entanglement. It was a delicate balance to strike, and events would soon make that balance increasingly difficult to maintain. The communist victory in China in 1949 heightened American concern that a Viet Minh success in Indochina might trigger a wider domino effect in Southeast Asia. After the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union recognized the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in January 1950, American officials reassessed Indochina as part of a broader Asian Cold War front. The conflict was no longer merely a French colonial problem. It had become something larger and more threatening to American strategic interests in the Pacific. In early 1950, the United States decided to support the French-backed state of Vietnam under Bao Dai as a non-communist Vietnamese alternative to the Democratic Republic. On the 8th of May 1950, President Truman approved an initial $10 million package of military aid for French forces in Indochina. This 1950 aid decision was justified in official documents as aimed at halting communist expansion in Southeast Asia rather than restoring colonial rule. The distinction mattered, at least rhetorically, even if the practical effect was to support French military operations against the Viet Minh. The September 1950 creation of the United States Military Assistance Advisory Group for Indochina, known as MAG Indochina, formalized an on-the-ground American presence to oversee military aid. MAG's mandate was to advise the French and associated states on the use of American equipment, not to command combat operations. Its initial strength was small, on the order of a few dozen officers and specialists, reflecting American caution about visible involvement in what remained a French war. The Americans were financiers and advisors, not commanders. In December 1950, France, the United States, and the three associated states of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia signed a multilateral defense assistance agreement regulating aid procedures. American policy linked increased support for France in Indochina to France's cooperation with NATO and European defense, integrating Asian and European security calculations into a global framework of alliances and mutual obligations that bound the Western powers together against communist expansion. By late 1950, American aid began to include not only small arms, but also vehicles, artillery, aircraft, and communications equipment for French Union forces. The outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950 reinforced Washington's perception that Indochina was part of a larger regional struggle with communist powers. Following the Korean War's start, officials feared that a setback in Indochina might weaken the overall credibility of containment in Asia. The two conflicts became linked in strategic thinking, and what happened in one theater seemed to have implications for the other. Between 1950 and 1954, total American military aid to the French in Indochina reached approximately $2.6 billion, according to several official and scholarly estimates. Another compilation of figures places the American contribution at about $1.1 billion, including roughly $746 million in Army materiel delivered directly to Indochina. The variance in estimates reflects different accounting methods and what categories of aid are included, but by any measure the sums were substantial and growing larger each year. By 1954, American support is generally estimated to have covered around 78 to 80% of France's annual war costs in Indochina. In contrast, in 1950, American funding accounted for well under 1% of total French war expenditures, illustrating the rapid escalation of assistance over just 4 years. In 1952, the American share of French Indochina war costs was about 1/3, with further increases in subsequent years as the conflict intensified. Aid levels rose steadily, and by 1953, American spending in support of French operations reached approximately $350 to $385 million. Economic aid supplements accompanied military assistance, helping finance French and associated state budgets and stabilize local currencies in the face of wartime pressures and inflation. The American Embassy in Saigon and MAG officers provided Washington with regular assessments of French and State of Vietnam capabilities and needs. Within the Truman administration, some officials argued that supporting French efforts risked associating the United States with colonialism, while others stressed the primacy of anti-communist containment. Policy debates weighed the danger that French defeat would encourage communist movements in neighboring Laos, Cambodia, and possibly Thailand. The stakes seemed to extend far beyond Vietnam's borders. As aid expanded, American officials pressed France to develop the state of Vietnam's national army so that local forces could assume a larger share of the fighting. MAG Indochina monitored the training and equipping of Vietnamese National Army units, though operational control remained primarily with French command. American advisors sometimes expressed frustration that French commanders limited their access to operational planning, constraining oversight of supplied materiel and limiting American understanding of how their aid was being used. American intelligence and military observers analyzed major engagements, such as the 1950 border campaign and the 1951 battles in Tonkin, to assess French performance and Viet Minh capabilities. The Eisenhower administration, taking office in 1953, maintained and expanded Indochina aid as part of its global New Look strategy against communism. The commitment to Indochina deepened under the new administration. Eisenhower and key advisors publicly invoked the domino theory, suggesting that a communist victory in Vietnam could lead to similar outcomes in other Asian countries. One by one, they might fall to communism like dominoes in a row. In 1953 and 1954, American aid covered an increasing share of the cost of French air, armor, and artillery assets employed in Indochina. As the French planned Operation Castor and the establishment of the Dien Bien Phu base in late 1953, American materiel and logistics support were essential to airlifting troops and equipment into that remote valley. MAG officers visited battlefields, including Dien Bien Phu during its early stages, to observe operations and logistical practices, though they did not exercise command. In 1954, discussions in Washington considered the possibility of direct American air intervention, sometimes called Operation Vulture, to assist the French at Dien Bien Phu, but no such intervention occurred. The proposal remained controversial and ultimately was not authorized. The risks of escalation were judged too great. Congressional and public opinion in the United States showed caution about direct military involvement, influencing the decision not to deploy American combat forces in 1954. Interagency debates also addressed whether regional collective security arrangements, such as a proposed Southeast Asia Defense Pact, could share responsibility for Indochina's defense and reduce the burden falling on France and its colonial forces alone. By mid-1954, American policymakers were simultaneously supporting French military efforts and exploring scenarios for a political settlement that would limit communist gains. At the Geneva Conference of 1954, the United States attended but did not sign the final accords, while signaling continued interest in supporting a non-communist regime in southern Vietnam once the French had departed. American documentation at the time framed continued assistance after Geneva as consistent with prior mutual defense aid agreements with the Associated States. The cumulative result by the summer of 1954 was that the United States had become the principal external financier of the French war effort in Indochina without assuming direct operational control of the fighting. Experience with MAG, Indochina, and the state of Vietnam's forces during 1950 to 1954 shaped later American advisory and aid practices in South Vietnam after the French withdrawal. The patterns established in these years would persist and expand in the decades to come, laying groundwork for a far deeper American involvement that few, in 1950, could have fully anticipated. In early 1949, French policymakers promoted what they called the Bao Dai solution as a way to rally non-communist Vietnamese nationalism within the framework of the French Union. The idea was simple in conception, if complicated in execution. France would create a Vietnamese government that could claim to represent national aspirations while remaining tied to French interests. The key figure in this strategy was Bao Dai, the former Nguyen dynasty emperor who had abdicated in August 1945 during the heady days of the August Revolution. Bao Dai had been approached by French representatives in 1947 and 1948. He agreed in principle to head a new Vietnamese government, but only if it had real autonomy. He understood that a puppet regime would have no credibility with the Vietnamese people. The negotiations were delicate and prolonged, stretching across many months of diplomatic maneuvering. Bao Dai sought guarantees that went far beyond what France had offered in earlier arrangements, including the discredited Cochin China Autonomy Statute that had set the Southern Territory apart from the rest of Vietnam. The Ha Long Bay Declaration of the 5th of June 1948 between High Commissioner Bollard and Premier Nguyen Van Xuan, made in Bao Dai's presence, stated that France recognized Vietnam's independence in principle, but the key details remained undefined. What did independence actually mean within the French Union? Who would control foreign affairs, defense, and economic policy? These questions hung unanswered, creating uncertainty about what the agreement truly meant in practice. Negotiations continued into early 1949. Bao Dai sought guarantees of Vietnamese unity and broader powers than anything previously on offer. The French, for their part, wanted to retain as much control as possible while offering enough to make the arrangement credible. It was a difficult balance to strike, and both sides maneuvered for advantage. The Élysée Accords were signed in Paris on the 8th of March 1949 by Bao Dai and French President Vincent Auriol. These agreements laid the legal basis for the state of Vietnam as an associated state within the French Union. Under the Accords, France solemnly recognized Vietnam's independence and committed in principle to recognizing Vietnam's unity following an appropriate referendum on the status of Cochinchina. The Élysée Accords envisaged that Vietnam would have its own government, national army, and control over internal administration while remaining within the French Union. Despite references to independence, the Accords preserved significant French control over foreign affairs, defense, and key aspects of economic and cultural policy. The fine print mattered as much as the grand declarations, and the fine print favored French interests. On the 20th of May 1949, the French National Assembly approved the reunification of Cochinchina with the rest of Vietnam, a prerequisite for creating a unified state of Vietnam. On the 14th of June 1949, an exchange ceremony at Norodom Palace in Saigon between Bao Dai and High Commissioner Leon Pignon marked the formal entry into force of the Élysée arrangements. The state of Vietnam was officially proclaimed on the 2nd of July 1949 as an associated state within the French Union, with Bao Dai as chief of state. Following this, Nguyen Van Xuan resigned to allow Bao Dai to form a new government under the new framework. The constitutional basis of the state of Vietnam was provided by Bao Dai's decrees, which established a council of ministers and administrative services, but did not immediately create a fully detailed written constitution. Within the French Union, the state of Vietnam had partial autonomy. It possessed its own internal administration, yet remained subject to French treaty obligations and union institutions. French authorities retained command over major military operations, even while recognizing the right of the state of Vietnam to build its own national army. The Accords allowed the state of Vietnam to conduct certain aspects of foreign relations, but France continued to represent it in many international forums during the initial years. On the 21st of October 1949, the United Nations Economic Commission for Asia and the Far East accepted the state of Vietnam as an associate member rather than the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, marking an early international recognition in an economic forum. On the 29th of January 1950, the French National Assembly ratified legislation granting autonomy to the state of Vietnam in line with the Élysée settlement. French President Vincent Auriol signed the ratifying law on the 2nd of February 1950, completing the French domestic legal process for the new arrangement. On the 7th of February 1950, the United States extended diplomatic recognition to the state of Vietnam, as well as to Laos and Cambodia. The United Kingdom recognized the state of Vietnam on the 7th and 8th of February 1950, roughly in parallel with American recognition. During February 1950, several other Western and Allied countries, including Belgium, Australia, Luxembourg, New Zealand, Greece, and Italy, also extended recognition. By early 1950, more than 30 states had recognized the state of Vietnam as the legitimate Vietnamese authority. Bao Dai's government aligned itself with the Western Bloc, while the Democratic Republic aligned with the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union. Two rival internationally backed Vietnamese regimes now existed, each claiming sole legitimacy. Within Saigon, the state of Vietnam's apparatus was built largely on existing colonial administrative structures, rebranded under Vietnamese leadership. French officials often held key advisory and technical posts within State of Vietnam ministries, reflecting ongoing dependence on French expertise and oversight. The State of Vietnam's armed forces began as Vietnamese units integrated into French Union forces and were gradually reorganized into a national army under nominal Vietnamese command. In December 1950, the State of Vietnam formally created its own national army, though French officers continued to occupy many senior command positions. The National Army's tasks included territorial security in government-held zones and participation in operations alongside French troops against the Viet Minh in the ongoing war. Financing and equipping the State of Vietnam's forces depended heavily on French resources and, increasingly after 1950, on American military aid channeled through French command. The State of Vietnam's political leadership consisted of Bao Dai as chief of state and successive prime ministers and cabinets, often drawn from moderate nationalist and pro-French circles. Many prominent Vietnamese nationalists, including Ngo Dien at the time, criticized the Élysée Accords as granting insufficient independence and refused to join the Bao Dai government. Critics within Vietnam and abroad described the regime as overly dependent on French power and questioned its popular legitimacy among the wider Vietnamese population. The Democratic Republic publicly rejected the State of Vietnam, asserting that only the Democratic Republic represented the legitimate aspirations of the Vietnamese people. In the countryside, especially where Viet Minh influence was strong, Bao Dai's government had limited direct administrative presence during 1949 and 1950. In urban centers like Saigon, the State of Vietnam controlled police, civil services, and municipal administration, though French security forces remained influential. The State of Vietnam's legal status as an associated state meant it was not a fully sovereign state under international law, but it enjoyed broader rights than a colony. French officials viewed the Bao Dai solution as a way to undercut Viet Minh claims to national representation while retaining strategic and economic interests in Indochina. American policy documents in 1949 and 1950 showed initial hesitation, with Washington seeking evidence of real independence and unity before fully backing the Bao Dai regime. After Chinese and Soviet recognition of the Democratic Republic, American support for the State of Vietnam increased, both as a counterweight to the Democratic Republic and as part of a broader containment policy. Public opinion in areas under State of Vietnam control was diverse, with some groups supporting the prospect of a non-communist Vietnamese state and others deeply skeptical of its independence from France. In propaganda, the State of Vietnam emphasized continuity with traditional Vietnamese monarchy through Bao Dai's role, while also presenting itself as a modernizing state aligned with the Western powers. For France, the creation of the State of Vietnam allowed presentation of the Indochina conflict as a defense of a recognized Vietnamese state rather than purely a colonial war. The coexistence of the Democratic Republic and the State of Vietnam after 1949 and 1950 institutionalized a two-Vietnam situation with each claiming to be the sole legitimate government of the country. By the end of 1950, the state of Vietnam had obtained significant diplomatic recognition and had begun forming its own armed forces, yet critical decisions in war and diplomacy remained heavily influenced by Paris. The foundation had been laid for a divided Vietnam that would persist for decades to come. In early 1950, Viet Minh leadership decided to prioritize the northern frontier, aiming to link their base areas in Viet Bac to the newly established People's Republic of China. Control of the border meant everything. It would transform the war from a struggle of attrition into something else entirely, opening corridors for weapons, ammunition, and the training that could turn guerrilla bands into a modern army capable of challenging French forces directly. The French maintained a series of border posts along Route Coloniale 4, known simply as RC4. This road ran parallel to the Chinese border for over 200 kilometers, threading through some of the most difficult terrain in all of Indochina. The posts at Cao Bang, Dong Quai, That Quai, and Lang Son controlled access to China and served as the main supply road to isolated and vulnerable French garrisons. Between 1947 and 1949, RC4 had already become one of the most dangerous roads in Indochina due to frequent Viet Minh ambushes. French convoys moved through constant threat, never knowing when the next ambush might come. On the 25th of May 1950, Viet Minh forces attacked and overran the French post at Dong Quai, temporarily cutting the road link between Lang Son and Cao Bang. French paratroopers retook Dong Quai 2 days later, but the battle demonstrated something new and alarming. The Viet Minh had concentrated several thousand troops and used artillery effectively. This was no longer mere guerrilla harassment. The Viet Minh were becoming a conventional fighting force. After May 1950, French command reduced some small RC4 posts, leaving stronger garrisons at key points. But the strategic situation had shifted. In mid-1950, Viet Minh preparations for a larger border campaign accelerated. Regular units were concentrated, logistics improved, and coordination with Chinese advisors tightened. Something significant was being prepared in the hills along the Chinese frontier. The autumn-winter 1950 border campaign, known to the French as the Battle of Route Coloniale 4, was launched in September 1950. On the 16th through 18th of September, Viet Minh forces captured Dong Quai again, securing a central position astride RC4. This time, there would be no quick French counterattack to retake the position. Following the loss of Dong Quai, French command made a fateful decision that would have disastrous consequences. They would evacuate Cao Bang and withdraw its garrison south along RC4. On the 3rd of October 1950, about 2,400 French troops and roughly 500 civilians departed Cao Bang in a southbound column toward Dong Quai. Simultaneously, a second French column, Groupement Bayard, moved north from that quay with orders to reopen the road and link up with the Cao Bang force. Neither column reached its objective intact. Viet Minh units ambushed both French formations in the rugged terrain around Dong Quai and along RC4, inflicting heavy losses and breaking up organized retreat. The battle lasted from late September to mid-October 1950 and ended with the destruction or severe degradation of several French battalions. Among the units badly hit were Foreign Legion and Moroccan Rifle battalions, which suffered such losses that some ceased to exist as coherent combat formations. It was a catastrophe. The fall of Cao Bang and the collapse of the RC4 position gave the Viet Minh control over a continuous stretch of the Vietnam-China border. Viet Minh sources refer to the 1950 border fighting as Chien Dich Bien Dui, the border campaign, emphasizing its role in opening corridors to China. The newly secured border allowed more regularized flows of weapons, ammunition, and equipment from Chinese depots into northern Vietnam through secure overland routes. After the campaign, Viet Minh logistics routes extended from Chinese territory through Cao Bang and Lang Son into Viet Bac and toward the Red River Delta. Chinese assistance after 1950 included not only material but also doctrinal guidance, encouraging larger, coordinated offensives against French strongpoints. The success of the border campaign boosted Viet Minh confidence and demonstrated the feasibility of multi-regimental operations against fortified positions when properly prepared. French political and military leaders regarded the RC4 defeat as a major setback and reassessed the viability of isolated frontier posts. In December 1950, Jean de Lattre de Tassigny was appointed French High Commissioner and Commander-in-Chief in Indochina to restore the situation in Tonkin after the RC4 disasters. De Lattre's strategy focused on securing the Red River Delta and building a fortified perimeter, the De Lattre Line, rather than trying to reoccupy all former border positions and risk similar disasters. While the French shifted to a more defensive posture around the Delta, Viet Minh planners under Vo Nguyen Giap prepared to move from border operations toward attacks on the De Lattre Line itself. By late 1950, Viet Minh forces had evolved from mainly regiment-level formations into a force organized around several infantry divisions. Division 308, sometimes called the Capital Division, was established in August 1949 and became one of the main regular divisions participating in major campaigns. Division 304 was created on the 10th of March 1950, adding another main force division to the Viet Minh order of battle. Following the border campaign, Division 312 was formed in December 1950, further enlarging the regular army. Division 320 was established in January 1951 and Division 316 in May 1951, giving the Viet Minh at least 5 full infantry divisions by mid-1951, capable of sustained conventional operations. An artillery division, numbered 351, was formed in March 1951, indicating growing emphasis on conventional fire support rather than guerrilla tactics alone. Between 1950 and 1951, Giap reorganized local and regional units into these divisions, creating a structure suitable for large-scale operations against French forces. By early 1951, Viet Minh divisional forces were capable of assembling 20,000 or more troops for a single major offensive against French positions, supported by regional and guerrilla elements. In January 1951, Giap launched a major offensive against French positions at Vinh Yen, northwest of Hanoi, using at least 2 full divisions in the assault. The Battle of Vinh Yen, fought around mid-January 1951, saw intense fighting as several Viet Minh divisions attempted to break the De Lattre Line's northwestern sector. French forces, including mobile groups and armored units, eventually held their positions, helped by concentrated artillery and air support. The fighting showed that Viet Minh divisions could mount large assaults, but also revealed the challenges they faced attacking well-fortified positions with coordinated firepower. In March 1951, Viet Minh forces attacked the mining and industrial area of Mao Khe, east of Hanoi, again testing the De Lattre Line along the coastal sector. French defenses relied on strong points, mobile columns, and air support, and succeeded in preventing a breakthrough toward the vital port of Haiphong. From the 29th of May to the 18th of June 1951, the Viet Minh mounted the Day River Campaign, targeting Phu Ly, Ninh Binh, and the Phat Diem area south of the Delta. Viet Minh units attacked French posts and attempted to penetrate deep into the Delta's southern approaches in a series of engagements. French mobile groups, river assault units, and airborne battalions counterattacked along the Dai River, eventually compelling Viet Minh forces to withdraw to the western hills after suffering significant and heavy casualties. The 1951 battles at Viet, Mao Kê, and along the Dai River marked a Viet Minh attempt to shift from mainly guerrilla operations to sustained, division-level engagements with concentrated firepower on both sides. For the French, these battles were an opportunity to apply firepower concentration made possible by interior lines within the Delta and newly fortified positions along the Delta perimeter. Viet Minh command analyses of the 1951 campaigns acknowledged both the gains in experience and the high costs of attacking fortified lines prematurely without sufficient fire superiority. After mid-1951, GIOP reduced large frontal attacks on the Delatra line and returned to a combination of positional warfare in selected sectors and guerrilla operations elsewhere in zones beyond the Delta perimeter. Control of the border after 1950 continued to be strategically important, enabling the Viet Minh to rebuild and re-equip divisions following the costly 1951 engagements against the Delatra line. The RC-4 defeat affected French morale and reinforced the belief that future operations should emphasize secure bases and shorter lines of communication to avoid similar disasters. Internationally, the Viet Minh border campaign's success contributed to perceptions that the Democratic Republic, backed by China, was evolving into a significant military force rather than solely a guerrilla movement operating in the shadows. By the end of 1951, the First Indochina War in the north had shifted toward a pattern where both sides employed larger formations. The Viet Minh fielded divisions while the French relied on fortified lines and mobile groups. The war had professionalized on both sides, entering a new and far more deadly and demanding phase. In May 1953, a new commander arrived in Indochina with orders to find a way out. General Henri Navarre replaced General Salan as commander-in-chief of French forces, inheriting a war that had ground on for nearly 7 years without decisive resolution. The French public had grown weary of the distant conflict, and successive governments in Paris had cycled through strategies without finding the key to victory or an acceptable path to disengagement. When he assessed the situation, Navarre found a strengthened Viet Minh fielding multiple divisions with steady Chinese support, while French Union forces had become largely static, tied down in dispersed defensive posts rather than conducting the offensive operations that might shift the balance. The situation required not merely tactical adjustments, but a fundamental rethinking of how France would fight the war. The French government's directive to Navarre was carefully worded. He was to create military conditions that would permit an honorable political solution in Indochina. By 1953, France was devoting around 8% of its national budget to the war, and pressure mounted in Paris for some kind of strategic turnaround that could bring the conflict to a close on acceptable terms. Navarre's initial assessment was blunt. The Viet Minh's main forces were mobile and capable of concentrating quickly, while French Union units remained overcommitted to protecting fixed positions scattered across the countryside. Thousands of soldiers stood guard duty at small posts and blockhouses, unavailable for the kind of massed operations that might trap and destroy enemy formations. He concluded that reorganization could still achieve a military situation favorable to negotiations, though it would require roughly 2 years of sustained effort and considerable political will in Paris. In July 1953, Navarre presented his strategic concept to France's National Defense Committee. The proposal, which came to be known as the Navarre Plan, called for a comprehensive reorientation of the war effort. Its central aim was to regain the initiative, reorganize forces, and prepare for a decisive engagement with Viet Minh main forces by late 1954 or 1955. The plan divided Indochina into two main theaters: a northern theater centered on Tonkin and a southern theater covering Cochinchina, along with parts of Laos and central Vietnam. For the 1953 to 1954 period, Navarre proposed adopting a largely defensive posture in northern Vietnam while focusing offensive operations in central and southern regions. This geographic division of effort would allow the French to consolidate where they were strongest while wearing down Viet Minh's strength in areas where the enemy was more vulnerable. French Union mobile forces would be concentrated into large, maneuverable groupings capable of massing against Viet Minh main units when the moment was right. To free French and other metropolitan units from static defense tasks, Navarre intended to assign more local security duties to the Vietnamese National Army and other associated state forces. A key element was building up a battle corps by progressively grouping battalions into regiments and regiments into divisions for major operations. The plan called for increasing French Union infantry battalions in Indochina by at least 12 through reinforcements from metropolitan France, with projections to form up to 7 or 8 fully mobile divisions by autumn 1954, combining French and associated state units. In Tonkin, Navarre planned to complete pacification of the Red River Delta by concentrating forces to clear Viet Minh networks and secure population centers. The Delta had never been fully secured despite years of effort, and Viet Minh cells continued to operate within zones the French nominally controlled. In the south and center, he proposed more aggressive offensives to weaken Viet Minh bases and improve the position of the state of Vietnam. The creation and rapid expansion of the Vietnamese National Army stood as a central component of long-term security. Navarre anticipated that Vietnamese units would progressively assume responsibility for holding areas already pacified, allowing French mobile forces to concentrate for larger operations against the enemy's main formations. American support for the plan was tied to this expansion of Vietnamese forces, which United States officials saw as an early form of localizing the conflict. The plan's projected timeline assumed that Viet Minh forces would need time to reorganize after previous campaigns, giving the French a window to rebuild and concentrate their strength. Navarre believed that the Viet Minh would avoid decisive engagements until they perceived a major advantage, so he aimed to create conditions that would induce GIAP to accept battle on French terms. If the enemy could be drawn into attacking well-prepared positions where French artillery and air power could be brought to bear, the resulting casualties might weaken the Viet Minh sufficiently to change the war's trajectory. The plan included establishing a series of land-air bases behind Viet Minh lines, from which mobile forces could conduct offensive operations. These bases were intended to be supplied mainly by air and to disrupt Viet Minh logistics and rear areas, compelling them to divert forces away from the main fronts. Full implementation of the broader concept was projected to extend beyond 1954 into 1955. In the meantime, Navarre began reassigning French units from scattered posts to larger groupings, especially around key logistical hubs and airfields. He continued and intensified the system of mobile groups as combined arms formations that could be rapidly deployed. In parallel, French commands sought to accelerate recruitment and training of Vietnamese, Laotian, and Cambodian units to bolster numerical strength without increasing metropolitan commitments. By mid-1953, the Vietnamese National Army already numbered several 100,000 personnel on paper, though training and equipment levels varied significantly. The Navarre Plan assumed continued and even increased American financial and material support to sustain force expansion and operations. Within the French staff, some officers questioned whether the planned buildup of Vietnamese forces and divisional structures could be completed in the available time. Training local troops to the standard required for major operations took months that might not be available. Others raised concerns that the Viet Minh retained strategic flexibility and might choose not to engage in the kind of set-piece battle Navarre sought. The enemy had shown patience before, waiting for the right moment rather than accepting combat on unfavorable terms. The plan maintained a commitment to defend Laos, as required by political decisions in Paris, which imposed additional constraints on force allocation and complicated the geographic focus Navarre had envisioned. To cover Laos and the northwestern approaches, Navarre looked for ways to position strong points along key routes between Vietnam and Laos. As part of this thinking, Navarre and his staff examined the possibility of seizing and holding remote valleys that could serve as air-supplied bases against Viet Minh supply routes. Within this framework, Dien Bien Phu in northwestern Tonkin was identified in mid-1953 as a potential land-air base to interdict routes into Laos. Operation Castor, the planned airborne seizure of the Dien Bien Phu Valley in November 1953, was conceived as consistent with Navarre's idea of offensive land-air bases. He expected that a fortified airhead there would both block Viet Minh movements toward Laos and possibly attract Viet Minh main forces into an engagement where French firepower could prove decisive. French documents from late 1953 show Navarre, assuming that air superiority and concentrated artillery would compensate for the valley's distance from other bases. Critics within the command argued that dispersing resources between pacification, protection of Laos, and major offensive bases risked overstretching available forces. Some French civilian and military analysts also questioned whether the political situation in France and rising war weariness would allow the multi-year timeframe Navarre envisioned. Navarre himself stressed that his plan required continuity of effort and adequate reinforcements. He warned that partial implementation would reduce the chances of success. The Viet Minh, meanwhile, interpreted French moves such as the occupation of Dien Bien Phu as attempts to create a strategic barrier and set conditions for a decisive confrontation. From late 1953, GIOP's redeployment of multiple divisions toward northwestern Vietnam was, in part, a response to the French application of Navarre's land-air base concept. On the eve of the main battle in March 1954, many core elements of the Navarre plan were in motion but not fully mature. French Union forces at Dien Bien Phu numbered roughly 15,000, reflecting Navarre's commitment of a substantial portion of available mobile forces to that base. The broader strategy had set the stage for a high-stakes confrontation intended to improve France's negotiating position. But it also concentrated extraordinary risk at key points where failure could prove catastrophic. In the remote valley of Dien Bien Phu, surrounded by jungle-covered hills 300 kilometers from Hanoi, that risk was about to be tested in ways no one in the French High Command had fully anticipated. Dien Bien Phu is a valley in northwestern Tonkin, about 300 kilometers from Hanoi, near the Laotian border, and surrounded by steep hills covered in dense jungle vegetation. The valley floor stretches roughly 16 kilometers in length, wide enough to accommodate an airstrip and a network of defensive positions, yet narrow enough that the surrounding heights dominate every approach and line of sight. The name itself comes from the Thai language, meaning roughly the seat of the border county prefecture, a reminder that this remote place had long served as an administrative center for the highland peoples of the region. In mid-1953, French Commander General Henri Navarre selected this location as a land-air base intended to block Viet Minh routes into Laos and draw their main forces into a set-piece battle where French firepower could prove decisive. The site included a former Japanese airstrip from the Second World War, which French planners considered suitable for redevelopment as a key supply airfield. If the strip could be held and kept operational, the valley could serve as a hub for offensive operations against enemy supply lines while threatening Viet Minh movements toward Laos. On November 20th, 1953, the French launched Operation Castor, the largest airborne operation of the First Indochina War. Between November 20th and 22nd, several French parachute battalions with artillery and engineers were dropped into the valley and quickly secured the airstrip and surrounding area. Brigadier General Jean Gilles commanded Operation Castor, while Colonel Christian de Castries was appointed to command the permanent garrison at Dien Bien Phu once the initial operation was complete. By late November 1953, French orders directed the garrison to ensure secure use of the airfield, hold the position, and conduct offensive sorties against Viet Minh concentrations. The French built a network of strong points around the valley floor, organized into several subsectors with positions named individually. These fortified points bore names that would become synonymous with sacrifice and struggle in the weeks ahead. Navarre and his staff expected that French artillery and air power, combined with fortified positions, would offset the valley's encirclement by hills. French planning assumed that the Viet Minh would not be able to deploy heavy artillery in large numbers into the surrounding heights or maintain them effectively under French air attack. This assumption would prove tragically mistaken. On the Viet Minh side, General Vo Nguyen Giap was responsible for planning and directing operations against Dien Bien Phu. After the French seized the valley, Giap decided to concentrate several divisions around the position, turning it into the main battlefield of the 1953 to 1954 dry season. Viet Minh forces committed to the operation included several infantry divisions, notably the 308th, 312th, 316th, and 320th, along with the 351st Heavy Artillery Division. Viet Minh planners, assisted by Chinese advisors, organized a large logistical effort to move artillery, anti-aircraft guns, ammunition, and supplies over 100 kilometers of mountainous terrain. The operation required extraordinary organization and sacrifice from thousands of ordinary Vietnamese. Tens of thousands of porters, bicycle transporters, and drivers hauled weapons and supplies along narrow trails into the hills around the valley. They moved at night to avoid French aircraft, resting by day in jungle cover. Heavy artillery, including howitzers, was disassembled, moved piece by piece up steep slopes through jungle so dense that paths had to be cut with machetes, and reassembled in camouflaged positions overlooking French strongpoints. The scale of this effort was unprecedented in the war, and it would prove decisive in the weeks ahead. By early 1954, Viet Minh anti-aircraft guns had been positioned to cover approaches to the airstrip and drop zones, creating a significant threat to French resupply flights. Giap initially contemplated rapid assaults, but after consultation and early preparations, adopted a more deliberate siege strategy. Viet Minh engineering units built extensive trench and tunnel systems, gradually extending toward French positions to reduce exposure while closing the distance for later assaults. By March 1954, the French garrison at Dien Bien Phu had grown to roughly 15,000 troops, including French, Foreign Legion, North African, African, and Vietnamese units. The garrison was well armed but increasingly dependent on aerial resupply for everything from ammunition to food and medical supplies. The battle began on March 13, 1954, when Viet Minh artillery opened a heavy bombardment on French positions. The intensity of the bombardment stunned the defenders, who had not anticipated such concentrated firepower from the surrounding hills. Shells fell with devastating accuracy, striking command posts, gun pits, and communication trenches. The rapid neutralization of the first major strongpoint demonstrated the effectiveness of Viet Minh artillery and trench preparations, and it signaled that the assumptions underlying the French defense had been fundamentally wrong. Subsequent attacks quickly targeted other outlying positions, undermining the outer defensive ring and restricting French freedom of maneuver in the valley. Viet Minh artillery fire made daytime landings at the airstrip increasingly hazardous. By late March, most aerial resupply had to be delivered by parachute drops, which were themselves vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire and often scattered supplies beyond the shrinking perimeter. The degradation and eventual loss of effective use of the airstrip reduced French capacity to evacuate wounded and bring in heavy equipment. Men who might have survived their injuries with proper evacuation died in the mud of the valley floor. In late March 1954, French units attempted counterattacks west of the main camp to disrupt Viet Minh anti-aircraft sites, but these operations did not restore control of the surrounding high ground. From late March to late April, the battle entered a phase of gradual constriction, with Viet Minh trenches advancing toward central positions and French outposts increasingly isolated from one another. Fighting during this period focused heavily on positions protecting the airfield sector and the eastern defenses. Each night brought new attacks, and each morning revealed fresh trenches dug closer to the French lines. As the perimeter shrank, French supplies of ammunition, food, and other essentials came under growing strain due to losses and dispersion of parachute drops. Men fought on half rations, conserving ammunition for the assaults they knew were coming. The monsoon rains began, turning the valley floor into a sea of mud that filled trenches and dugouts with brown water. French command in Hanoi and Saigon considered options for relief operations, but overland relief was judged impracticable due to the distance and Viet Minh control of the approaches. No column could fight its way through hundreds of kilometers of enemy-held territory in time to matter. Requests for large-scale American air intervention were discussed at high levels but not authorized. International attention to Dien Bien Phu grew as the siege coincided with preparations for the Geneva Conference that would address Korea and Indochina. While American air support was explored, domestic and allied reservations prevented any direct combat role in the battle. The garrison would have to hold or fall with the forces already committed. The Viet Minh maintained sustained artillery fire on central strongpoints through April, gradually reducing the French defense area to a compact central pocket. By early May 1954, French positions were confined to a small sector around the command post and remaining fortified points on the valley floor. On May 7, 1954, after renewed Viet Minh assaults and further contraction of the perimeter, organized resistance at Dien Bien Phu ceased, and the French base fell. The fall of Dien Bien Phu marked the first time a major Western force had been defeated in a large, isolated fortified base by a revolutionary army in the post-1945 era. The battle had cost both sides dearly. French casualties included over 2,000 killed, nearly 7,000 wounded, and more than 11,000 taken prisoner, many of whom would die in captivity during the long march to prison camps in the north. Viet Minh losses were also severe, with estimates of 8,000 killed and another 15,000 wounded in the assaults on the fortified positions. News of the defeat had immediate political repercussions in Paris, accelerating French willingness to negotiate an end to the war. In Geneva, where negotiations were already underway, the Viet Minh victory strengthened the bargaining position of the DRV delegation considerably. For the Viet Minh and DRV, the outcome validated the years of emphasis on building regular divisions, heavy artillery, and extended supply networks. The victory proved that a determined revolutionary movement, properly organized and supplied, could defeat a European power on the battlefield. For the French military, the battle led to extensive post-war evaluations of assumptions about air-supplied strongpoints, artillery vulnerability, and intelligence on enemy capabilities. The fall of Dien Bien Phu contributed directly to the conclusion of agreements in Geneva that would end the First Indochina War and reshape the future of Vietnam for generations to come. The Geneva Conference opened its Indochina discussions on May 8, 1954, the day after the fall of Dien Bien Phu. The timing was not coincidental. Negotiators gathered in the Swiss city while the echoes of battle still reverberated through French political circles, and the shadow of military defeat hung over every proposal and counteroffer that would follow. For nearly 8 years, France had fought to retain its colonial position in Southeast Asia, and now that struggle was ending, not with victory, but with the search for an acceptable peace. The conference brought together representatives of the 5 great powers: the Soviet Union, United States, United Kingdom, France, and the People's Republic of China. For the Indochina phase, additional delegations represented the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the State of Vietnam, the Kingdom of Laos, and the Kingdom of Cambodia. The DRV delegation was led by Deputy Prime Minister Pham Van Dong, who arrived in Geneva in early May fresh from the triumph at Dien Bien Phu. His delegation came to the table with military victory lending weight to their demands. The State of Vietnam delegation represented the Bao Dai regime, which claimed to be the legal government of Vietnam and opposed any settlement that would legitimize the DRV's authority. The American delegation, headed by Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, participated in discussions but maintained a careful distance from commitments it was not prepared to honor. The Chinese delegation, led by Premier Zhou Enlai, played an active role in mediating between France and the DRV and in shaping the final compromise on Vietnam. Zhou proved a skilled diplomat, balancing support for his communist allies with a pragmatic desire to avoid direct American intervention in the region. The Soviet delegation, under Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, supported a negotiated settlement that would end the war while maintaining socialist gains in North Vietnam. Both communist great powers encouraged the DRV to accept a compromise short of nationwide immediate victory, calculating that half of Vietnam secured was better than a wider war that might draw in American forces. France's delegation aimed to obtain a ceasefire that would allow a withdrawal from Indochina while preserving some influence and protecting the associated states. After nearly 8 years of war, French public opinion had turned decisively against the conflict, and the government in Paris needed an exit. The DRV's main objective was to secure recognition of its authority in at least the northern part of Vietnam and to obtain a timetable for nationwide elections that would, in time, deliver the entire country to their control. American policy at Geneva sought to prevent outcomes that would significantly strengthen communist influence in Southeast Asia, but Dulles avoided direct commitment to military enforcement of any settlement. The United States remained deeply suspicious of any agreement that might be seen as rewarding communist aggression. On July 20, 1954, the parties agreed that Vietnam would be provisionally divided along a demarcation line near the 17th parallel. The main military document was the Agreement on the Cessation of Hostilities in Vietnam, signed by French and Viet Minh military representatives. This agreement established a provisional military demarcation line along the 17th parallel, with a demilitarized zone on either side. The accords specified that French Union forces would regroup south of the line, while Viet Minh forces would regroup to the north. Both sides were given a 300-day period to complete the regrouping and withdrawal of their forces across the demarcation line. The Geneva documents stressed that the 17th parallel demarcation line was provisional and was not to be interpreted as a political or territorial boundary. This was meant to be a temporary arrangement, not a permanent division of the country. A final declaration of the Geneva Conference, not formally signed by all participants, set out political principles including plans for nationwide elections in Vietnam. The declaration envisaged free general elections by secret ballot to be held in July 1956 under international supervision to reunify Vietnam. The division was to last only until these elections, after which Vietnam was intended to be unified under whichever government the people chose. The United States made a unilateral declaration at Geneva stating that it would refrain from the threat or use of force to disturb the agreements, but it did not accept all their provisions. The American Declaration also noted that the United States would view any renewal of aggression in violation of the accords with grave concern, signaling a conditional stance that left considerable room for future involvement. The State of Vietnam delegation did not sign the agreement on the cessation of hostilities and later argued that it was not bound by the electoral timetable. To supervise implementation, the accords established an International Control Commission consisting of representatives from India, Canada, and Poland. The ICC's mandate included monitoring ceasefire compliance, troop regroupments, and the introduction of foreign military personnel and bases. Separate agreements were concluded at Geneva for Laos and Cambodia, providing for ceasefires and withdrawal of foreign and Viet Minh forces from those territories. For Vietnam, the accords prohibited the introduction of new foreign troops and the establishment of foreign military bases in either zone, pending elections. The DRV accepted the Geneva settlement as a compromise, securing authority in the north, but leaving a large part of the country under rival control. The French government accepted the accords and proceeded to withdraw its forces from northern Vietnam according to the agreed schedule. The State of Vietnam government, based in Saigon, became the principal authority south of the 17th parallel following French withdrawals. Implementation of regroupment zones led to the movement of Viet Minh units from southern zones to the north and French allied units from the north to the south. The Geneva provisions allowed Vietnamese civilians a 300-day period during which they could freely choose to move north or south of the demarcation line. This extraordinary migration window would reshape the demographic and political landscape of both zones. During this period, large numbers of civilians relocated, particularly from northern to southern Vietnam. Estimates vary, but between roughly 600,000 and 1 million northerners moved south, many of them Catholics who feared persecution under communist rule, along with others opposed or apprehensive about DRV authority. Entire parishes relocated together, led by their priests. At the same time, tens of thousands of people from the south, often Viet Minh cadres and sympathizers who had fought against the French, moved north into DRV-controlled territory to await the promised reunification elections. The American Navy's Operation Passage to Freedom transported approximately 310,000 people from northern ports such as Haiphong to southern Vietnam between August 1954 and May 1955. French naval and merchant vessels, as well as overland convoys, also moved people and equipment during the regroupment period. In the north, The DRV government took over former French administrative structures in Hanoi, Haiphong, and other cities as French forces withdrew. In the south, the state of Vietnam extended its administration into areas formerly held by the French. The partition created two distinct zones, a DRV-controlled north with its capital at Hanoi, and a non-communist south with its capital at Saigon. Both governments began consolidating separate political, military, and economic systems within their respective zones. The failure to implement the scheduled 1956 nationwide elections would later become a central point of contention between North and South Vietnam. By late 1954, major powers already differed in interpreting the Geneva Accords, particularly regarding the binding nature of the final declaration and election provisions. China, the Soviet Union, and the DRV publicly supported the Geneva Framework as the basis for future reunification through elections. The United States and the state of Vietnam emphasized the provisional and military nature of the accords and questioned conditions for genuinely free elections under DRV supervision. The Geneva settlement ended open hostilities between France and the Viet Minh, but left Vietnam divided into two opposing political entities along the 17th parallel. What had been intended as a temporary military demarcation line would harden over the coming years into a border between two hostile states, each claiming to represent the legitimate aspirations of all Vietnamese people. The agreements also marked the end of France's role as the primary external power in Vietnam and opened the way for greater American involvement in the South. By the end of 1954, the provisional partition was firmly in place and the seeds of the next conflict had already been planted in the soil of a divided nation. And so the First Indochina War came to its close. What had begun with shots fired in the darkness of a December night in Hanoi ended with signatures on documents in a Swiss conference hall. The French era in Vietnam was over. But for the Vietnamese people, both north and south of the 17th parallel, the struggle for their country's future was far from finished.